Officers harassed an elderly woman on her own porch, but when her son arrived, their faces turned pale. Grace Williams, a 78-year-old black woman with silver hair that framed her kind face, sat quietly on the porch of her modest home in the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia. Her eyes, deep with the wisdom of a life filled with challenges, sparkled as she gazed out at the familiar street she had called home for over 50 years. Grace's hands, worn from decades of hard work, gently rocked her chair back and forth, providing her a sense of peace amidst the warm, late afternoon breeze. Born in the 1940s, Grace had lived through the pain of segregation, witnessing firsthand the struggles of the civil rights movement. She had marched alongside brave souls fighting for equality, even facing down police dogs and fire hoses. Despite the hardships, she had raised her family with dignity, passing on the values of perseverance, integrity, and the power of education to her children. Grace's pride and joy was her son, Daniel Williams, who had risen from their humble beginnings to become a respected judge in the state of Georgia. Now 50 years old, Daniel had a reputation for his sharp intellect and fairness. He was a man who looked beyond race and economic status in his courtroom, always striving for justice. Despite his success, Daniel had never forgotten where he came from. Every Sunday, without fail, he visited Grace, bringing her groceries and sitting with her for hours, soaking in the stories of her life. Grace kept Daniel's childhood room untouched, a shrine to the dreams she had nurtured for him. As the years passed, the neighborhood around Grace had changed. What was once a tight-knit black community had slowly gentrified. New families, mostly white, moved in, bringing with them rising property values and a wave of renovations. Grace watched with a mixture of curiosity and concern. While she greeted every new neighbor with a smile, there was always an underlying feeling that the neighborhood's dynamics were shifting in ways she couldn't quite predict. That afternoon, as Grace sat on her porch with a glass of sweet tea in hand, she watched the world pass by, enjoying the quiet. She nodded politely as Mrs. Porter, one of her new neighbors, walked by with her small poodle. Grace noticed how Mrs. Porter quickened her pace as she approached, clutching her purse a little tighter, her eyes avoiding Grace's. Grace sighed deeply. She had seen that kind of reaction before, and it still stung, even after all these years. Some things never change, she thought to herself, straightening her back and continuing to rock gently in her chair. She had weathered far worse in her lifetime. Little did she know, that peaceful afternoon was about to be shattered. The sudden sound of sirens pierced the air, jolting Grace from her thoughts. 2 police cruisers came speeding down the quiet street, screeching to a halt a few houses away, right in front of Mrs. Porter's house. Grace's heart began to race, memories of past encounters with law enforcement flooding back. She watched anxiously as 3 officers, 2 white men and a Hispanic woman, stepped out of their vehicles. Their hands hovered near their holsters as they approached Mrs. Porter, who was gesticulating wildly, clearly upset. Grace strained to hear what they were saying, snippets of the conversation drifting across the warm afternoon air. Words like suspicious person and doesn't belong here sent a chill down her spine. She realized, with a sinking feeling, that Mrs. Porter was pointing in her direction. Before Grace could fully grasp what was happening, the officers began striding purposefully toward her porch. Her hands tightened around the arms of her rocking chair, willing herself to remain calm. "Ma'am," called out the lead officer, a burly man with cold blue eyes and a clipped tone, "we've had a report of suspicious activity in the area. Mind if we ask you a few questions?" Grace, though her heart pounded in her chest, straightened herself in the chair and met the officer's gaze with calm dignity. "I don't mind, officer," she replied steadily, "but I'm afraid I don't know what help I can be. I've just been sitting here, enjoying the afternoon." The female officer stepped forward, her expression more measured, though there was still suspicion in her eyes. "Ma'am, a resident reported seeing someone matching your description walking around the neighborhood, looking into windows. Can you account for your whereabouts in the past hour?" Grace's eyes widened in disbelief. "Young lady," she said, her voice firm but respectful, I've been sitting right here on this porch since after lunch. I haven't moved from this spot, let alone been walking around the neighborhood. At my age, taking a walk would be quite the challenge. The third officer, who had remained silent until now, let out a derisive snort. Yeah, right, he muttered, look, lady, we've got a witness who says otherwise. Why don't you just admit what you were really up to? Grace felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. I have no reason to be peeking into anyone's windows, officer. I've lived here for over 50 years, and I resent the implication that I would engage in anything improper. The lead officer's posture shifted, becoming more confrontational. Listen, we can do this the easy way, or the hard way. Just admit you were checking out the houses, and we can take you down to the station to sort this out. Grace's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained firm. I've done nothing wrong, and I have no intention of going anywhere with you, she said, her words measured. If you have any more questions, you can ask them right here on my porch. The situation escalated quickly. The officers, clearly frustrated by Grace's refusal to comply, demanded to see proof of residence and identification. I don't carry my ID to sit on my own porch, Grace retorted, her patience thinning. My name is Grace Williams, and I've lived here for over half a century. If you don't believe me, feel free to check the property records. The lead officer's face darkened. That's it, he said, his voice cold. If you won't cooperate, we'll have to take you in for obstruction. Stand up slowly, and put your hands behind your back. Grace's heart pounded. She thought of her son, Daniel, and the lessons of resilience she had taught him. She took a deep breath and made a decision. I will not, she said, her voice strong and unyielding. I have done nothing wrong, and I will not be treated like a criminal in my own home. If you want to arrest me, you'll have to physically remove me from this porch. The officers exchanged uncertain glances, clearly not expecting such fierce resistance from an elderly woman. They began to move in when a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, catching everyone off guard. A tall, commanding figure stepped out of the SUV, his tailored suit and authoritative presence demanding attention. Grace's face lit up with relief. Daniel! She called out, her voice wavering slightly, grateful for his timely arrival. Daniel Williams, a man known for his calm demeanor even in the most heated courtroom, walked up the driveway with an expression that sent a ripple of tension through the officers. His presence was commanding, and his eyes, usually so measured, were dark with barely contained fury as he approached the porch where his mother stood. Excuse me, officers, he said, his voice even but firm, what exactly is happening here? The lead officer, still visibly shaken from the realization of who they were dealing with, attempted to maintain control of the situation. Sir, this is a police matter. We've had reports of suspicious activity, and we're questioning. Daniel raised a hand, silencing the officer mid-sentence. Suspicious activity? You mean to tell me that my mother, a woman who has lived in this neighborhood longer than any of you have likely lived in this city, is the suspect you're questioning? The officer opened his mouth to respond but found himself lost for words. His confidence had faltered, especially now that the situation had shifted so drastically. Meanwhile, Grace stood behind her son, her heart swelling with pride as she watched Daniel take control. Daniel's voice became steely, his gaze fixed on the lead officer. Do you know who I am, officer? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The lead officer swallowed hard, his voice now strained. We didn't know, sir. Judge Williams, we. You didn't know, Daniel interrupted, his voice colder now. And yet, you thought it appropriate to come here, to her porch, and harass an elderly woman without any real evidence. Behind them, a small crowd of neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Whispers spread through the group as they recognized the prominent figure standing on the porch, defending his mother. Mrs. Porter, who had been the one to call the police in the first place, stood at a distance, her face flushed with embarrassment. Seeing her, Daniel turned and called out, "Mrs. Porter, is this the suspicious person you claimed was lurking around your house?" The woman shifted nervously, wringing her hands as all eyes turned to her. I saw someone, and with all the burglaries lately, I thought. Daniel's tone softened slightly, but his words were still firm. "And without even realizing it, you jumped to a conclusion. Do you know how dangerous that can be?" His question cut through the air, and Mrs. Porter could only nod, shame washing over her face. Turning back to the officers, Daniel's expression hardened once again. "Now, I suggest you all leave. Unless you have a valid reason to continue harassing my mother, this conversation is over." The lead officer hesitated, clearly rattled by the situation. We were just following up on a report, sir." "Following up," Daniel echoed, "by accusing an innocent woman of something you have no proof of. I will be filing a formal complaint against you and your department, and I expect this incident to be investigated thoroughly." The officers, realizing they were out of their depth, nodded stiffly. "Yes, Judge Williams," the lead officer finally said, his voice subdued. "We'll be going now." With that, the three officers retreated to their vehicles, leaving the quiet street as suddenly as they had arrived. The small crowd of neighbors began to disperse, but the tension in the air lingered, a stark reminder of the dangerous assumptions that had been made. As the last police car drove away, Grace let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Daniel turned to her, his eyes softening. "Are you okay, Mom?" Grace, ever the pillar of strength, nodded. "I'm fine, son. But this isn't over." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Grace looked down the street, where the neighbors had been watching. Her voice was calm but resolute. "This wasn't just about today, Daniel. This is about years, decades, of being seen as less than, of being treated as suspicious just for existing. It's time to stand up, not just for myself, but for everyone who has been in my shoes." Daniel sighed, knowing his mother well enough to understand that she wasn't going to back down. "You're right. So what's the next step?" Grace straightened her back, her eyes sharp with determination. "We're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. I want to file a formal complaint, and I want the community to hear about this. This kind of treatment needs to stop, and if I have to be the one to make it happen, so be it." Over the next few days, Grace and Daniel took the first steps toward action. Grace, with her calm resolve, wasn't one to shy away from a challenge, especially one that would benefit not just her, but her entire community. She and Daniel sat together at the kitchen table one morning, sipping coffee as they discussed the formal complaint that would be filed against the police department. "We need to make sure every detail is documented," Daniel said, scanning the notes he had taken during the confrontation. His brow furrowed as he considered the legal aspects of the situation. "The fact that they came to your porch, ready to arrest you without real evidence, is a violation of your rights. That's where we'll start." Grace, sitting across from him, nodded thoughtfully. "It's not just about me, Daniel. I want this complaint to go beyond what happened on my porch. This needs to shine a light on how people in this community, people who look like me, are treated every day." Daniel looked at his mother with admiration. Despite everything she had been through, her focus was always on the bigger picture, on the change that could benefit others. He reached out and placed his hand over hers. "We'll make sure your voice is heard, Mom." Grace smiled softly, squeezing his hand. "Thank you, Daniel. But I'm not alone in this. There are so many others who have been through the same thing, and I want to speak for them, too." In the days that followed, the complaint was filed, and the local community quickly caught wind of what had happened. The small, seemingly quiet neighborhood was abuzz with conversations about the incident. Some residents were supportive of Grace, understanding the gravity of what she had endured. Others, however, were more cautious, not wanting to stir up trouble with the police. One afternoon, while Grace was watering her garden, Mrs. Porter hesitantly approached her. The guilt from the incident was still evident in her eyes, and she stood nervously at the edge of Grace's yard, unsure of how to begin. "Mrs. Williams?" she called softly. Grace looked up from her flowers, her expression neutral but not unkind. "Yes." Mrs. Porter shifted her weight, her eyes cast down. "I wanted to apologize for what happened the other day. I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand. I was scared, with everything that's been happening in the neighborhood lately. But I realize now that I made a terrible mistake." Grace wiped her hands on her gardening apron and walked over to the edge of the yard, standing face to face with Mrs. Porter. There was a long pause before Grace spoke. "I appreciate your apology, Mrs. Porter. But it's important to understand that this isn't just about one mistake. It's about the assumptions that people make based on fear. Fear of people like me. We've lived here for over 50 years, and I've never had any trouble with this neighborhood. But one phone call from you, and I'm treated like a criminal in my own home." Mrs. Porter looked down, tears welling in her eyes. I know, and I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to cause you harm." Grace's expression softened slightly. "I believe you, Mrs. Porter. But next time, before you act out of fear, take a moment to think. We all live in this neighborhood together, and it's time we start acting like it." Mrs. Porter nodded, wiping away a tear. "I'll do better, Mrs. Williams. I promise." As the days went on, the community began to shift. More neighbors came to Grace to show their support, some bringing flowers or offering to help around her house. The conversation in the community deepened, with people beginning to talk more openly about race, prejudice, and the way fear had shaped their interactions with each other. Meanwhile, the police department, aware that a formal complaint had been filed by someone as influential as Judge Daniel Williams' mother, began to feel the pressure. News of the incident spread, and soon it wasn't just local reporters asking questions, national media outlets picked up the story. The department was put on the defensive, scrambling to justify their actions. But it was clear that the tide was turning. One afternoon, as Grace sat on her porch, a familiar car pulled up to the curb. It was Officer Sarah Martinez, the Hispanic officer who had been present during the confrontation. Grace's heart skipped a beat as she watched Sarah step out of the car, her posture less rigid than it had been that fateful day. Sarah walked slowly toward the porch, a look of genuine remorse on her face. "Mrs. Williams," Sarah began as she reached the porch steps, "may I speak with you?" Grace studied her for a moment before nodding. "Of course. Have a seat." Sarah sat down carefully on the edge of the porch, clearly nervous. She took a deep breath before speaking again. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened that day. And I've realized that we were wrong. The way we handled things. The way we treated you. I want to apologize. Not just for myself, but for the entire department." Grace remained silent for a moment, letting Sarah's words hang in the air. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. But an apology is just the beginning. What happened to me happens to others all the time. If you truly want to make a difference, you need to look at the bigger picture." Sarah nodded quickly, her eyes filled with regret. "I know. I've been seeing things in the department that don't sit right with me. I've started keeping track of other incidents, situations where racial profiling was clear. I know it's not enough, but I want to do something about it." Grace looked at Sarah, her expression softening slightly. "It sounds like you're starting to understand. But understand this, it's not just about the police changing. It's about the entire community. If people like you and me don't stand up and speak out, nothing will ever change." Sarah swallowed hard, realizing the weight of Grace's words. "I'm ready to stand up, Mrs. Williams. Whatever it takes." Grace nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Then let's see what we can do together." In the weeks that followed, Grace and Officer Sarah Martinez formed an unlikely alliance. The formal complaint that Grace had filed against the police department was under investigation, but the wheels of justice turned slowly. Still, Grace wasn't content to sit and wait for the system to change on its own. She was determined to be proactive, to ensure that the community around her, the place she had called home for so long, would never again be the backdrop for such an injustice. Sarah, now fully aware of the systemic issues within the department, began to take more risks. She confided in Grace that she had continued documenting other cases of racial profiling and misconduct within the force. "It's not just about that day with you," Sarah explained one afternoon, sitting on the porch next to Grace. "I've been seeing it for a while now, but I didn't know how to confront it. There's this unspoken rule in the department: you don't question your fellow officers. But I can't stay silent anymore." Grace, always the calm, guiding presence, listened carefully. "Speaking out is never easy," she said softly. "Especially when you're going against people who are supposed to have your back. But real change only comes when people are brave enough to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost." Sarah sighed deeply, her gaze fixed on the ground. "I know. But it's hard, Mrs. Williams. If I push too hard, I could lose everything, my job, my career." Grace reached out and gently placed a hand on Sarah's. "Doing the right thing often comes with a price, Sarah. But ask yourself, can you live with the consequences if you stay silent?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth. Sarah nodded slowly, her resolve strengthening. "You're right," she said quietly. "I need to act." Together, they began attending community meetings, speaking out about racial bias and the need for accountability in law enforcement. Grace became a regular presence at town halls and neighborhood gatherings, where people listened intently to her story. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for the future of her community. Daniel was often by her side, offering legal insights and helping his mother navigate the complexities of the formal process. It wasn't long before their efforts began to draw attention beyond the local neighborhood. The media picked up on Grace's story, portraying her as a symbol of the ongoing fight for justice. News outlets ran headlines like, "A Mother's Stand, Elderly Woman Challenges Police Misconduct and the Judge's Mother Who Took on the System." With the national attention came both support and backlash. Grace received letters from people across the country, thanking her for her courage and sharing their own stories of similar encounters with law enforcement. But not everyone was supportive. Some in the community were uncomfortable with the attention, fearing that it would make their neighborhood a target for further unrest. And there were still those who believed the police had done nothing wrong, that Grace's actions were blowing things out of proportion. One evening, as Grace and Daniel sat together on the porch, she read aloud from a letter sent by a young woman in another state. "Dear Mrs. Williams," she began, her voice steady, "I want to thank you for standing up. My family and I have experienced similar treatment, but we never had the courage to fight back. Seeing you and hearing your story gives me hope that maybe things can change." She put the letter down and looked over at Daniel. "This," she said softly, "is why we're doing this. For people like her." Daniel nodded, pride swelling in his chest. "You're making a difference, Mom. Don't ever doubt that." But despite the progress, there were moments of doubt and frustration. Grace, who had always valued her privacy, found herself thrust into the public eye in a way she had never expected. The pressure of being a symbol for change weighed heavily on her, and there were nights when the stress kept her awake, wondering if she had made the right decision. Then there was the matter of Sarah's growing role in the movement. As she continued to document the department's misconduct, Sarah became more isolated within the force. Her fellow officers, sensing her shifting loyalties, began to treat her with suspicion. Whispers followed her down the hallways of the station, and she noticed that her assignments were becoming more difficult, more dangerous. One evening, after a particularly tense community meeting where emotions had run high, Sarah confided in Grace. "It's getting harder, Mrs. Williams. I can feel the pressure every day. Some of my colleagues, they're not happy with what I'm doing. And I can't blame them. I'm going against the code. Grace listened carefully, nodding in understanding. I know it's hard, Sarah. But remember why you're doing this. It's not just for me, it's for everyone who has ever been treated unfairly, for the next person who might be profiled or harassed. If you stay silent, nothing changes. Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. I just don't know how much longer I can do this. Grace smiled gently. You're stronger than you think. And you're not alone. You have allies in this fight, even if it doesn't always feel like it. As the months passed, the complaint against the police department moved forward. Investigations revealed a pattern of racial profiling that had gone unchecked for years. The pressure on the department mounted, and public outcry grew louder. Meanwhile, Grace's quiet strength and Sarah's determination had inspired others in the community to speak out. More people began coming forward with their own stories, and a wave of activism swept through the neighborhood. Daniel continued to stand by his mother's side, ensuring that the legal process remained steady. He watched with pride as Grace's influence grew, but he also saw the toll it was taking on her. She was strong, but she was still human. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Grace looked out at the quiet street and sighed deeply. It's been a long road, hasn't it? Daniel nodded, watching her closely. It has. But you've done more than most people could ever dream of doing, Mom. Grace smiled softly, her eyes filled with warmth. We're not done yet, though. No, Daniel agreed, we're not. But we're getting closer. As the investigation into the police department deepened, Grace Williams found herself becoming a prominent figure not only in her community but in the broader conversation about police reform. The media attention continued to grow, and her story became a rallying cry for those who had experienced racial profiling and injustice. Yet, with every step forward, there were new challenges and obstacles that tested her resolve. One afternoon, Grace sat in her living room, her hands clasped together as she listened to the local news. The anchor reported on the growing tensions within the police department, which had been forced to address multiple claims of racial bias. Officer Sarah Martinez had provided damning evidence in the form of her documentation of various incidents. The report highlighted that the department had been placed under federal scrutiny, and there was talk of restructuring the leadership. As the segment ended, Grace sighed, the weight of it all pressing on her shoulders. She had never intended for her quiet life to become the center of such a large movement, but now that it had, she couldn't back down. Daniel, ever the vigilant son, noticed his mother's expression as he entered the room. Mom, he said gently, sitting beside her, you've done so much already. It's okay to take a step back if you need to. No one expects you to carry all of this on your own. Grace looked at her son, her eyes tired but determined. I can't stop now, Daniel. There's too much at stake. If we let up, even for a moment, they'll sweep this under the rug, and nothing will change. Daniel nodded, understanding her resolve. I know. But I don't want you to wear yourself down. You've been at the forefront of this for months. Grace smiled softly, reaching out to touch his hand. I'll be fine. Besides, I'm not doing this alone. Sarah, the community, we're all in this together. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. Daniel stood up to answer it, revealing Sarah standing on the porch, her face serious but resolute. Mrs. Williams, she said as she stepped inside, we need to talk. Grace motioned for her to sit. What's going on, Sarah? Sarah took a deep breath, clearly struggling with what she was about to say. There's been pushback, serious pushback from inside the department. Some of the officers are accusing me of betraying the force. They're saying that I've put the department at risk by coming forward with the evidence. Grace listened quietly, nodding for her to continue. They've started giving me the worst assignments, trying to make things difficult for me. I've even heard whispers about them looking for a reason to fire me. They're doing everything they can to push me out. Grace's heart sank. She knew this fight would come with consequences, but hearing how much Sarah was sacrificing for the cause was painful. I'm so sorry, Sarah. I didn't want this to happen to you. But Sarah shook her head, determination etched on her face. Don't apologize, Mrs. Williams. This is the right thing to do, and I knew what I was getting into. I wanted to let you know that things are getting more complicated. But I'm not backing down. Grace smiled, her admiration for the young officer growing with every passing day. You're a brave woman, Sarah. It takes a lot of strength to do what you're doing. Sarah looked down, a small smile tugging at her lips. I learned from the best. As the weeks passed, the movement within the community continued to gain traction. Grace and Sarah organized meetings, bringing together residents, local officials, and even a few sympathetic police officers who wanted to see change from within. These meetings weren't always easy, emotions ran high, and not everyone agreed on the best course of action. But Grace's steady presence and Sarah's courage kept the conversations moving forward. One night, during a particularly heated meeting, a young man from the neighborhood stood up, his voice trembling with frustration. I'm tired of waiting for things to change, he said, his eyes filled with anger. We've been dealing with this for years, and it's still the same story. What's the point of all these meetings if nothing ever gets done? Grace stood up, her voice calm but firm. I understand your frustration. Believe me, I've lived through more years of injustice than I care to count. But change doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow process, and it takes people like you, people who are willing to fight, to make sure it happens. The young man shook his head. But how long do we have to wait? How much longer do we have to fight? Grace met his gaze, her eyes steady. As long as it takes. The room fell silent, her words sinking in. She knew it wasn't the answer anyone wanted to hear, but it was the truth. Change was never easy, and it rarely came quickly. But Grace was in it for the long haul, and she hoped that her determination would inspire others to stay the course. As the meeting ended and people began to leave, Sarah approached Grace. You have a way with words, she said with a smile. That young man needed to hear that, even if it wasn't what he wanted. Grace chuckled softly. Sometimes the truth isn't what we want to hear, but it's what we need. Sarah nodded, her admiration for Grace clear in her eyes. I'm glad we're doing this together, Mrs. Williams. Grace smiled warmly. So am I, Sarah. So am I. As the momentum of the movement continued to grow, Grace Williams found herself becoming a central figure in the fight for police reform in her community. The meetings she and Sarah Martinez had organized were becoming larger, with more voices joining the conversation. However, the stakes were rising, and tensions both inside and outside the police department were mounting. One morning, as Grace sat quietly on her porch, sipping her coffee and watching the early sunlight filter through the trees, her phone rang. It was Daniel, calling to check in, as he did every day. How are you doing, Mom? He asked, his voice warm and familiar. I'm all right, Daniel, Grace replied, smiling at the sound of her son's voice. Just taking a moment to enjoy the quiet before the day gets busy. Busy, I'm sure, Daniel said with a chuckle. I saw the news last night. They're saying you've become the face of this movement. How does that feel? Grace sighed softly, her smile fading slightly. It feels heavy, Daniel. I never wanted this kind of attention. But now that I have it, I know I have to use it for good. Daniel's voice became serious. You've been doing incredible work, Mom. But don't forget to take care of yourself, too. The pressure is only going to get worse as this moves forward. I know, son, Grace said, her voice soft but resolute. But this is bigger than me now. We're fighting for something that matters. Just as she finished speaking, there was a knock at the door. Grace set her coffee cup down and went to answer it, finding Sarah standing on the porch, her face filled with concern. "Mom, I'll call you back later," Grace said quickly before hanging up and turning her attention to Sarah. "What's going on?" Sarah hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, closing the door behind her. "There's something you need to know, Mrs. Williams." Grace's heart skipped a beat at the serious tone in Sarah's voice. "Tell me," she said, motioning for Sarah to sit. Sarah took a seat at the kitchen table, her expression tense. "There's been talk in the department. Some of the higher-ups are starting to push back hard. They're not happy with the way this investigation is going, and they're looking for ways to undermine it." Grace raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by undermine?" Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "They're looking into your history, trying to find anything they can use to discredit you. I've heard whispers that they're digging up old records, even things from decades ago. It's clear that they're desperate." Grace leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing in thought. "So, they think they can smear me to make this go away?" "It seems that way," Sarah said. "But there's something else. They're targeting me, too. I've been reassigned to a desk job, and I've heard that they're planning to start an internal investigation into my conduct. It's retaliation, plain and simple." Grace's heart ached for Sarah. The young officer had risked so much by standing with her, and now it was clear the department was trying to punish her for it. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I didn't want this to happen to you." Sarah shook her head firmly. "No, Mrs. Williams, don't apologize. I knew this could happen. But we can't let them scare us off. This is too important." Grace nodded, her resolve strengthening. "You're right. We can't let them win." The next few weeks were challenging for both Grace and Sarah. The smear campaign against Grace intensified, with certain news outlets picking up on old, minor infractions from her past, things like unpaid parking tickets or disputes over property lines from decades ago. But Grace held her ground, refusing to let the noise distract her from the larger goal. At the same time, Sarah continued to face increasing pressure within the department. The internal investigation into her conduct was launched, and she found herself isolated from her colleagues, who viewed her as a traitor. But despite the growing difficulties, Sarah remained steadfast in her commitment to the cause. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings, Grace sat on her porch with Daniel, who had come over to check on her. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. "You've been quiet today, Mom," Daniel said gently, glancing over at her. Grace took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'm just thinking about everything. About how far we've come, and how much further we still have to go." Daniel nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "It hasn't been easy. But you've done more than most people ever would. You've inspired so many, including me." Grace smiled, though it was a tired smile. "Thank you, Daniel. But this fight, it's taking a toll on all of us. Sarah, especially." "I know," Daniel said softly. "She's a strong woman, but even she has her limits. We need to make sure she's protected." Grace nodded. "Yes, we do. But we also need to protect the truth. No matter what they throw at us, we can't lose sight of why we're doing this." As they sat together in the fading light, the resolve between them deepened. The battle ahead would be difficult, but Grace and Daniel knew they couldn't turn back now. The next day, Grace and Sarah attended another town hall meeting, this time with a larger audience. People from neighboring communities had begun to join the conversation, and the pressure on local officials was mounting. As Grace took her seat at the front of the room, she noticed Sarah glancing nervously around the crowd. "Everything all right?" Grace asked quietly. Sarah nodded, but her expression remained tense. "Yeah, it's just. I'm always on edge these days. I feel like I'm being watched." Grace placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's arm. "You're not alone in this, Sarah. We're in this together. The meeting began, and local officials took turns addressing the audience. Many spoke about the importance of unity, but it was clear to Grace that they were dancing around the real issues. The community wanted concrete changes, not empty promises. Finally, it was Grace's turn to speak. She stood at the podium, her voice steady but filled with passion. I've lived in this community for over 50 years, she began, and in that time, I've seen the best and the worst of what this place can be. But what happened to me isn't just about one incident. It's about a system that's been broken for a long time. The room fell silent as she spoke, her words resonating with the crowd. We can't fix what's wrong by ignoring it. We have to face it head-on, even when it's uncomfortable. We have to hold people accountable, not just for what happened to me, but for what's been happening to so many others in this community. As Grace continued, she noticed heads nodding in agreement, and a sense of hope began to fill the room. She had a way of speaking that made people listen, not just to her words, but to the deeper truths behind them. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Grace sat back down, feeling a sense of accomplishment but knowing that the real work was still ahead. After the meeting, a young woman approached Grace, her eyes filled with gratitude. Mrs. Williams, she said softly, thank you for speaking out. I've been scared to talk about what happened to me, but hearing you tonight, it's given me courage. Grace smiled warmly and took the young woman's hand. You're not alone, she said. None of us are. The movement was gaining momentum, and Grace's voice had become a beacon of hope for many. But as the fight for justice continued, the challenges would only grow. Grace, Sarah, and Daniel knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were ready to face it together, with their community standing beside them. Several months had passed since the initial incident on Grace Williams' porch. The formal investigation into the police department had led to significant changes. A few officers were dismissed, others were reprimanded, and new protocols were implemented to prevent further instances of racial profiling. Grace's complaint had triggered a movement that many in the community would remember for years to come. One quiet afternoon, Grace sat on her porch as usual, watching the neighborhood. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden light over the houses. The street was peaceful again, but it no longer felt like the same place. The community had changed, not just in the way it looked, but in the way people saw each other. Neighbors who once walked past each other in silence were now having conversations. Walls built by fear and misunderstanding had started to come down. Sarah Martinez joined her on the porch, sitting in the chair beside Grace. Her face was more relaxed than it had been in months, the tension of the investigation finally behind her. You did it, Mrs. Williams, Sarah said with a small smile, gazing out at the street. You really made a difference. Grace turned to her with a quiet smile. We did it, Sarah. None of this would have happened without you. Sarah shook her head. I never would have had the courage if it weren't for you standing up that day. You showed me how to be brave. For a moment, they sat in silence, letting the peaceful evening settle around them. It was a rare moment of calm after so many months of turmoil. Daniel arrived a short time later, carrying a basket of groceries as he stepped onto the porch. I thought I'd bring dinner, he said, setting the basket down. I figured you could use a break from cooking. Grace smiled warmly at her son. Always thinking ahead, aren't you? He grinned. You taught me well. As they prepared dinner together in the kitchen, the small house was filled with the warmth of family and friendship. Laughter and conversation flowed easily, the heaviness of the past months lifting as they enjoyed the simplicity of being together. Later that evening, after Sarah had left and the dishes were put away, Grace and Daniel sat quietly in the living room. The sound of crickets outside filled the comfortable silence. You know, Mom, Daniel said after a moment, I've been thinking about everything that's happened. How far we've come. Grace nodded, her eyes thoughtful. It's been a long road, Daniel. It has, he agreed, then paused, looking at his mother with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. I'm proud of you, Mom. For standing up, for not backing down. You've shown me what it means to fight for what's right, even when it's hard. Grace smiled, her eyes reflecting the quiet strength that had carried her through her entire life. I've learned a lot along the way too, Daniel. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Not just for me, but for this community, for everyone who stood with us. They sat together for a long time, neither needing to say much more. The fight for justice had been long and difficult, but now, there was peace, at least for a moment. As Grace got ready to go to bed that night, she paused at the window, looking out at the street where it had all begun. The memories of that day were still vivid in her mind, but the fear and anger had been replaced with something else, something stronger. Hope. Hope for a future where her children and grandchildren wouldn't have to fight the same battles she had. Hope for a community that could continue to grow and learn together. She closed the window and turned off the light, knowing that, while the work wasn't finished, they had taken the first steps towards something better. And for now, that was enough.